In the heart of winter, when the cold bites deeper than the bones and the snow piles higher than the fences, Eli Stolzfus, a quiet Amish blacksmith, discovers a secret that will change the way his community survives the long nights. But when the fire refuses to burn out, the true cost of his invention is yet to be understood in both his heart and his hearth. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of faith, craftsmanship, and quiet resilience speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. The winds of January blew with a biting ferocity, howling through the cracks of the Stolzfus family's humble home. Eli stood in the corner of the blacksmith shop, his broad hands steady, his breath rising in the cold air. He wasn't just a blacksmith by trade. He was the pillar of the Lancaster County community, a man whose work defined more than tools or horseshoes. Eli was a maker of things, but lately he had been making something much more important. A way for his family and his people to survive the winter nights without fear of the flames dying out before dawn. As he stoked the fire in his forge, the crackle of the flames seemed to whisper old secrets, secrets that had been passed down through generations of Amish blacksmiths, though few had ever thought to use them. Eli wasn't sure where the idea had come from, whether it had been from a long night of prayer, the echo of a forgotten story from his father, or the sheer need for survival. But there, in the dim light of his shop, he had figured it out. A way to burn wet wood that would last through the night. He had no intentions of sharing his secret just yet. Something this simple, this miraculous, needed testing first. With winter's fury shaking the window panes, Eli pulled a thick bundle of freshly cut logs from the corner. The wood was damp from the recent rains, a challenge for anyone who relied on the fire for warmth. The furnace, a towering metal beast in the corner of the shop, was cold and uninviting. Yet Eli's hands moved with the quiet precision of a man who knew his craft as well as he knew the back of his own hand. He stacked the logs carefully, then poured a few handfuls of a special concoction he had been testing for weeks, a mixture of crushed charcoal and herbs. The scent of it was unfamiliar but rich, like the earth itself had been worked into the fire. Eli struck a match and the flames caught quickly, casting flickering shadows against the walls of the shop. For hours, he watched the fire, tending it gently as the night grew colder. The wet logs burned brighter and longer than any fire had before. In the stillness of the room, Eli's heart swelled with quiet satisfaction. The fire didn't falter. It didn't lose its warmth or strength. The night was alive with warmth, not just in the shop, but in his soul. He had done it, made a fire that wouldn't die out, but Eli had yet to see the cost of his discovery. There were no easy answers in the world of simple men and faith, and he knew that some secrets could bring both blessing and burden. For now, though, he would let it burn. He would let it warm his hands and his heart. By morning, the world outside had become a frozen wasteland, a sea of white with no horizon in sight. The snow, which had fallen steadily through the night, covered everything in a blanket that seemed to hold the world still. Eli walked to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered out into the frigid landscape. The barn stood quiet, its roof heavy with snow, the horses tucked away inside, content to wait for the warmth of the day's fire. But there was something stirring in Eli's chest, a quiet unease that he couldn't shake. The fire had burned all night, yes, but what would happen when his neighbors learned of it? Could this trick, as his son Aaron had called it, really be a blessing? Or would it disrupt the natural order of life in the community? The Amish lived by the rhythm of simplicity and self-reliance. Firewood was gathered in the fall, cut and stored in preparation for the long winter. It was a practice that had sustained them for generations. But wet wood, like that which Eli had used last night, was an unpredictable factor. It was an outsider, a rebel in the family of firewood that had always served the community so well. As Eli worked through the morning, hammering nails into his latest project, a plow for the upcoming spring, his mind kept returning to the fire. What if he shared his secret? What would the community think of a man who had found a way to cheat nature, to bend the rules of God's design? It was the questions that followed that gave him pause. By noon, Eli's brother-in-law, Jonas, arrived, his boots heavy with snow, as he stepped into the warmth of the shop. "I heard about your fire," Jonas said, his voice light, but with a note of curiosity. "What's this about burning wet?" Wood all night? Eli turned, wiping his brow with a cloth. It's nothing, Jonas, just something I've been testing. Jonas raised an eyebrow. Something like that could change everything. You're telling me you burned wood that shouldn't burn? Eli hesitated. He had never liked the thought of being different, of standing out. But Jonas was waiting for an answer. Finally, he nodded, the weight of his discovery suddenly settling on his shoulders. It burned, Jonas. It stayed hot, even through the wettest wood. Jonas studied him for a long moment, then grinned. Well, Eli Stolzfus, you may have just found something that could keep the whole community warm. The words hung in the air, both a compliment and a challenge. Eli's heart raced, but he couldn't bring himself to tell Jonas the truth that something as simple as wet wood could burn like kindling had left him unsettled, wondering if he had crossed a line. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension that hung over Eli Stolzfus like the heavy fog of a coming storm. Word of his discovery spread quickly through the community, carried by the hushed voices of neighbors and the inquisitive glances of those who heard the tale. Eli had never been one to seek attention. He was a man of work, of hands rough from labor, and of faith that was simple and steadfast. But now, his secret, the fire that burned through wet wood and stayed strong through the night, had turned him into something of a curiosity. At first, the visits were polite and inquisitive. Men from neighboring farms stopped by the blacksmith shop, hands in pockets and eyes filled with wonder as they asked to see the fire for themselves. Eli, ever hesitant, had shown them his hearth with a quiet pride, explaining the technique he'd used to keep the flames alive. He even demonstrated, placing fresh, wet logs on the fire to show how they burned steadily, without the struggle that most men would expect. His heart swelled each time the fire held, its heat filling the room and pushing back the cold outside. But as the days wore on, Eli began to feel a subtle shift. The visits became more frequent and the conversations more probing. Neighbors who had once greeted him with simple nods and brief words now lingered, their questions sometimes becoming sharper. The men who had called him a fool for his slow and careful construction of the cabin now wanted to know everything: how he had done it, what the mixture was, and if he could teach them the trick. One afternoon, as Eli worked on his latest project, a set of horseshoes for the neighboring farm, the door of his shop swung open with a gust of cold air. It was Jonas again, his expression serious this time. "Eli," he said, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him, "we need to talk." Eli looked up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "What's wrong?" "Something's stirring in the community, Jonas," began, his voice low. "There's talk that you've found a way to keep fires burning with wet wood, and that's not sitting right with everyone. Some folks are saying it's against the natural order, that we're not meant to have a fire that strong. Some of the elders are worried it's too much, that you're trying to play God." Eli's heart dropped. The tension he had felt building in his chest for days now had a name. It wasn't about the fire. It was about control, about breaking the simple rules that had governed their lives for so long. He had never meant to disrupt anything. He had simply wanted warmth that would keep his family safe through the brutal winter nights. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, Jonas," Eli said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought it was a gift, not a curse." Jonas placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "I know, but sometimes even the good things bring questions we aren't ready to answer." The weight of Jonas's words settled on Eli like a cold gust of wind. He had never thought of the consequences beyond his own family's warmth. But now, with the community questioning the fire, Eli realized that the simple act of survival could become a burden, one that he might not be prepared to carry. Days passed with a heavy silence between Eli and the community. The once open admiration had turned to suspicion, and the fire that had warmed his hearth now felt like a furnace of guilt burning within him. Each night, as the snow fell in thick blankets over the land, Eli found himself staring into the embers, unable to escape the creeping unease that had settled deep within his soul. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the long shadows of winter stretched over the land, Eli found himself standing at the edge of the barn, looking out over the snow-covered fields. His mind, normally calm, was a swirl of conflicting thoughts. What had he done? He had built a fire that would keep them warm through the coldest nights, but now he wondered if it had come at too high a cost. Was this his test of faith? His moment to surrender control to something greater than himself? "Father?" Eli turned to see his daughter, Rachel, standing in the doorway, her face soft with concern. At just 16, she was the quiet strength of their family, her presence always steady, her faith unshakable. "Yes, Rachel?" Eli replied, his voice gruff but gentle. "You've been staring out there for hours," she said softly, stepping closer to him. "I know something's troubling you." Eli sighed, turning his gaze back to the snowy fields. "I've caused a stir, Rachel, something I never meant to do, the fire. It's not just a blessing anymore. People are questioning it." "They're questioning me." Rachel stood beside him, her hand brushing against his as they watched the wind carry the snow in gentle waves. "But you only wanted to help, didn't you?" "I did," Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was helping, but now I'm not sure if it's right. What if I've gone too far? What if I've disrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed?" Rachel's eyes were steady, her wisdom far beyond her years. "Sometimes, Father, we're given gifts that we don't fully understand. Maybe you were meant to make the fire burn like this, just like others were meant to find warmth in the way they always have. But the choice to share it is up to you." Eli looked down at his daughter, the simple truth of her words cutting through the turmoil in his heart. He had always taught her that faith wasn't just in what was seen, but in what was felt. And now he realized that his faith needed to guide him through this decision. With a deep breath, Eli turned to Rachel, his mind made up. "I'll go to the elders. I'll show them the fire, but I'll also show them my heart. If they say it's wrong, then I'll let it go. I'll never use it again." Rachel smiled softly, her hand resting on his arm. "I think they'll see your heart, Father. And sometimes that's all that matters." As Eli turned toward the barn, his heart was heavy but at peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that in this moment he was following the path that faith had set before him, a path that would lead him to the truth, no matter the cost. The wind howled through the trees, swirling the snow in every direction as Eli walked through the deepening drifts toward the meeting house. The fire inside him, the warmth of the hearth he had built, the secret that had burned so brightly in his own soul now seemed distant, replaced by the quiet unease of what he was about to face. Eli had spent the entire evening in prayer, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. He had prayed not for an answer, but for peace. And as he reached the door of the meeting house, he felt a quiet strength, knowing that he was doing the right thing. It wasn't about the fire or the warmth it provided anymore. It was about something deeper, trust. Inside, the elders were gathered, their faces serious as they sat in the dim candlelight. The simple wooden benches creaked as Eli stepped forward, the only sound his boots in the heavy silence. The old men, patriarchs of the community, the ones whose words shaped the life of Lancaster County, watched him with patient, questioning eyes. "Eli," said Elder Jonas, his voice steady yet kind. "You've asked for a moment to speak. We've heard the stories, and we've heard your neighbors' concerns. Tell us what is in your heart." Eli took a deep breath, standing tall in the midst of their watchful gaze. He had built many things with his hands, but this, speaking his truth, admitting his fear, was the hardest thing he had ever done. "I've built something that keeps the fire burning even through the wettest wood," Eli began, his voice low but firm. "I didn't mean to make trouble. I thought only of warmth, of keeping my family safe through the coldest of nights. I've seen what happens when the cold takes hold of a man's bones, and I didn't want that for my family, for anyone in this community." He paused, looking each elder in the eye, hoping they saw more than the man who had defied tradition. "But I know that in our faith, we don't always seek to change the ways that have been passed down to us. We don't seek to play with nature, but the fire, it burns differently. And I can't deny that it has done what nothing else could." The silence that followed stretched out like the stillness of a winter's night. Eli's heart beat in his chest like a steady drum, but his thoughts were scattered, uncertain. Was this the right path? Would they condemn him for stepping beyond the bounds of tradition? Finally, Elder Jonas spoke again. "You've done something unusual, Eli, but not unwise. The fire that you've discovered it is not against nature, as some might think. Nature, as we know, is not simply the cold or the wind. It is the will to survive, the need for warmth, the hope to help one another through the trials we face. Eli's heart lifted, but only slightly. There was more to be said. But, Jonas continued, his voice soft but resolute, you must remember the reason we do things the way we do. It is not simply for tradition's sake, but to live in harmony with what we are given. If this fire can serve our community without disrupting our way of life, then we must consider it. But it must be shared with wisdom. Eli nodded, understanding. I won't keep it to myself, he said quietly. I'll share it only if it helps, but if it's wrong, I'll let it go. Elder Jonas smiled faintly. We will watch, Eli. Watch and see how the fire spreads. Watch and see how it burns, not just in the hearth, but in your heart. And with those words, Eli's shoulders seemed to lighten. The decision had been made, not by him alone, but by the whole of his community. The weight of the burden had been shared. Weeks passed in the slow rhythm of winter, and Eli continued his work in silence. The fire he had created now became a symbol of something greater, not of his own cleverness or invention, but of the quiet resilience of the Amish way of life. The fire was tested not just by the wet logs it burned, but by the trust it had to inspire. People began to use the method in small ways, at first quietly, then with more confidence. It wasn't something that everyone would adopt, not at first. Some still clung to the ways they had known, the old practices of gathering only dry wood, of keeping the fire small and controlled. But in every corner of the community, whispers of the secret fire spread, shared from neighbor to neighbor in hushed voices and with grateful smiles. Eli watched from a distance, content but wary. He had shared the secret, but now he understood the weight of what it meant to share something so powerful. He had seen the fire burn brightly in his own hearth, but now he saw it in the lives of others. He saw it in the barns that stayed warm through the worst storms, in the homes that remained a refuge from the bitter winds, in the faces of families who no longer feared the long, cold nights. And yet, there was a part of him that still questioned, still wondered if he had done the right thing. Had he disturbed the delicate balance that had kept his people in harmony with the land? Had his desire for warmth clouded his judgment? One evening, as Eli sat by his own hearth, the fire burning steadily before him, his son Aaron joined him, sitting silently beside him. It was a quiet moment, one of many they had shared in the glow of the flames. "Father," Aaron said softly, breaking the silence, "do you think we've done the right thing?" Eli looked down at the fire, the warm light flickering on his son's face. "I think it's a gift, son, but gifts are not always easy to accept. Sometimes the fire we create is not the fire we expect." Aaron nodded, his gaze steady. "I think it has helped, Father. It has helped all of us." Eli smiled, a small, quiet smile. "Then perhaps that is enough," he said, as the flames crackled softly, burning bright and true through the night. And in that moment, Eli knew that the fire was not just something that burned in the hearth. It was a fire that burned in the hearts of those who believed in faith, in each other, and in the simple truth that sometimes the hardest things are the ones worth doing. The fire would continue to burn, not just in the wood, but in the quiet strength of a community that had learned to trust one another. And for Eli Stolzfus, that was enough. The rest would come in time, like the warmth of a fire that never dies out. The days grew longer as the harsh grip of winter slowly began to loosen. Yet despite the changing seasons, Eli Stolzfus could not shake the feeling of unrest that had taken hold of his soul. While the fire continued to burn brightly in the homes of his neighbors, the weight of his decision still pressed upon him. Each night, as the cold wind howled outside, Eli found himself drawn to the warmth of his hearth, but not in the same way as before. The comfort of the flames now felt like a quiet reminder that some things, no matter how well-intentioned, came with consequences. It had been 2 months since Eli had shared his secret with the elders, and while the community had embraced the warmth it offered, not everyone had been so understanding. There were murmurs of dissent among the older members of the congregation. Some had begun to question whether the fire, now burning brighter and longer than any fire had before, was truly in line with their faith. Others whispered that it was a temptation, a test that they had passed by, rejecting the innovation. Eli had heard the whispers, of course. His friends, the ones who had welcomed his invention with open arms, began to avoid him in the streets, their eyes averted whenever they passed his shop. The men who had once come to learn from him about the fire now seemed uncertain, as if they feared the consequences of what they had been taught. It was during one of these quiet walks through the village, his mind heavy with the weight of unspoken words, that Eli ran into Jonas. The old man had been a steady presence in Eli's life, a mentor, a friend, and a fellow believer. But today, his expression was troubled, his brow furrowed with concern. "Eli," Jonas began, his voice soft but full of a quiet urgency. "We need to talk." Eli stopped, turning to face his friend. "What's wrong?" "The fire," Jonas said, his voice lowering even further. "Some of the families have begun to say that it's not just the warmth that's burning, but something else. There's talk that the fire is too much, that it has become a symbol of something we're not meant to have." Eli's heart sank. "I never meant for it to be that way." "I know you didn't," Jonas replied. "But some things cannot be undone once they've been set into motion. You may have lit the fire, but now we must decide if it is still meant to burn." Eli felt the weight of the words like a stone in his chest. He had thought he had done the right thing, that he had simply provided a way for his people to endure the winter's harshness. But now, with his neighbors questioning the very essence of his invention, Eli began to wonder if the warmth of the fire had come at too high a cost. "I didn't want to break the balance," Eli said, his voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to help. I wanted to give them warmth in a time of need." "And you did," Jonas answered, his hand resting gently on Eli's shoulder. "But you must also remember that not all gifts are meant to be kept forever. Some gifts are for a season, and when that season is over, it's time to let go." Eli stood in the cold silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The fire had given so much, but had it taken too much in return? He had to face the truth. No matter how bright the flame, there would always be those who feared the heat. The following days felt like a long, drawn-out pause in time. Eli spent less and less time in the blacksmith shop, and more time alone with his thoughts. The fire, which had once been a symbol of his ingenuity and his love for his family, now seemed like a silent reproach. It burned in the hearth, yes, but it burned in his conscience as well. The coldness that had gripped the village in the depths of winter had begun to ease. Snow turned to slush, and the first signs of spring emerged timidly from beneath the snowbanks. The earth was stirring, and with it, so were the hearts of the people. Yet, despite the warmth returning to the land, Eli could not ignore the growing distance between himself and the community. One morning, as he walked through the village square, he noticed that his neighbors, who had once nodded to him with a quiet respect, now passed by without a word. Their eyes avoided his, and their steps quickened as if they feared being drawn into a conversation they didn't want to have. It was as if the secret of the fire had become a barrier between them, a wall he could not see, but that he felt more strongly with each passing day. It was on one such morning, as Eli stood near his shop door, that Aaron came to him, his face calm but with a glimmer of something in his eyes, a question that had been lingering there for some time. "Father," Aaron said, breaking the silence, "when will we stop?" Eli looked at his son, puzzled for a moment. "Stop what?" "The fire," Aaron replied quietly. "When will we stop using it?" Eli's heart twisted at the question. He had known it was coming, but the words still stung. For so long, he had clung to the belief that the fire was a gift, that it was the answer to a need. But now, as he saw the strain it was causing, he knew in his heart that the time had come to let go. "We will stop, Aaron," Eli said, his voice steady, though his heart was breaking. "When it no longer serves us." And just like that, the quiet end came. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fanfare, no grand declarations. The fire that had once burned so brightly, so fiercely, was simply let go, not with a final act of rebellion, but with a quiet surrender. Eli no longer kept the secret, no longer sought to warm the community with the invention that had once seemed so necessary. But as the fire faded into the past, Eli found peace. The community would heal. The warmth of the hearth would return to the hands of those who needed it, and Eli's role in that story, that simple story of faith, of humility, and of letting go, would remain etched not in the burning embers of a fire, but in the quiet, steady work of a life lived in service to those around him. And when the warmth returned to Lancaster County, it would be the kind that lasted, the kind built not on invention or fire, but on the simple truth of community, trust, and love. The fire that burned in Eli's heart had served its purpose. It was time to let it rest, knowing that sometimes the brightest flame is the one that fades away quietly, leaving nothing but warmth in its wake. Spring came slowly to Lancaster County, reluctant as though it feared another winter might follow. The earth softened beneath Eli's boots as he walked to the fields with Aaron. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh grass, but beneath it all lingered a chill, the lingering remnants of a winter too harsh to be forgotten easily. Though the snow had long since melted, the cold, bitter silence between Eli and his neighbors remained. People had stopped coming by. The shop, the chatter that had once filled his evenings had quieted, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the quiet hum of the forge. Each day he struggled with the decision to let the fire go, questioning if he had done the right thing. Had he broken something that could never be repaired? But then, as he bent low to help Aaron with the tilling, a figure appeared on the horizon, an older man, his coat patched and his step slow but sure. Eli recognized him instantly. It was William, the elderly farmer, who had never been one to follow trends but always spoke with the wisdom of a man who had lived through seasons of abundance and hardship alike. Eli straightened, wiping his brow with his sleeve, and watched as William came closer. When the old man reached him, he didn't offer pleasantries. Instead, he placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, his eyes kind but firm. "I heard what you did," William said, "and I heard why you stopped." Eli didn't know what to say, but William continued, "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to know when enough is enough. You did right, Eli. You made us all think, made us all remember." Eli stood still, the weight of the past months lightening for the first time. As the seasons turned, so too did the quiet tension that had once hung between Eli and the community. Though the fire that had burned so fiercely was now nothing more than a memory, its impact was not lost. Eli Stolzfus had been the catalyst for a deeper reflection, not just on the warmth of the hearth, but on the warmth of the heart and the lessons of humility, faith, and self-restraint. One afternoon, as Eli worked in his garden with Aaron, he noticed a familiar figure approaching Jonas, the elder who had guided him through his doubt. His steps were slow, but there was a lightness in the way he moved, a peace that Eli hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking, Eli," Jonas said, his voice steady, "about the fire you made, and I've come to realize something." Eli waited, his hands still in the soil as he turned to listen. "Sometimes the true fire is not the one that burns brightest," Jonas continued, "but the one that keeps burning quietly, without a need for attention. Your fire helped many, but in letting it go, you've helped us more." Eli smiled, a quiet warmth rising in his chest. "I only did what felt right." Jonas nodded, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "And that's the hardest thing to do. You found the balance, the fire that lives in the heart, not the hearth." The two stood there for a moment, the sun casting a golden glow over the fields. Eli realized in that instant that the warmth he had sought for so long wasn't in the flame, but in the simple acts of faith and love that he shared with those around him. The seasons would change, but the warmth of his community and the quiet strength of his faith would endure.